I just wanted to quit. I'm tired of the pain. I don't know what to do. It just keeps coming and coming and coming. I've even thought about ending it all. Those statements are not uncommon when people are going through serious grief. Not uncommon at all, because many people see grief as something happening to them rather than something that they are doing. And grief is something that we do. We do grieving. And grieving is work. In order to give you some idea of my own experience in regard to the topic, I do have my doctorate degree in ministry from Abilene Christian University. I did receive the certificate of ministerial counseling from the Marriage and Family Institute at Abilene. I am qualified as a law enforcement chaplain through the International Conference of Police Chaplains. I've attended numerous continuing education classes at the psychiatric hospitals of Laureate and Brookhaven in Tulsa in past years. I have counseled members almost from the beginning of my ministry, which is now over 63 years. I have conducted anger management seminars. I have conducted grief recovery seminars, and I have conducted marriage communication seminars. Kay and I, for 45 years, that's my wife, have trained men and their wives for leadership, and part of that includes my taking men to the hospitals to learn how to do hospital visitation, to take men with me whenever I visit someone who has suffered a death, and have been training those men and have done so for 45 years. This doesn't count the fact that I'm the last of 5 children, and all of my siblings are now dead. All of my in-laws are dead. My mother and dad are dead, and my wife's parents are dead. We have been through a great deal of grief in our time, and I'm not telling you everything because I don't have time to do it, and that's not the purpose of tonight's lesson. I just want you to understand I do have some background and some knowledge in what I'm talking about, but I have to say most of it is practical experience dealing with people. I remember specifically going to visit Sister Dodd in my very first ministry. It was the very first time I was ever asked to visit someone who was in the last stages of terminal cancer. And I know that when I went to visit her, I was scared. I had no idea what I would say, and bless her heart, she made it so easy. She cheered me up and tried to comfort me in giving her comfort, because I don't think I was doing a very good job. But through the years, I've learned a whole lot, but I still have a lot to learn in this area. So I'm not coming to you as an expert. I'm coming to you as a fellow struggler, dealing with griefs of my own, just as many of you may be dealing with griefs of your own. And it was during that time that I learned that the capacity to grieve starts almost at the age of 3 months, because even a 3-month-old baby is able to grieve the mother's leaving it. And you can tell there's grief by the way they cry. In fact, if you have been a parent or grandparent, you know there's a difference between a grief cry and the I want my way cry. A cry of anger and a cry of anguish. And even at that age, children can know the grief of anxiety separation. And even though they cannot understand adult grief, when adults grieve, they feel a reaction to it. They sense it in some way or another. In fact, even our animals, our pets, will sense our grief and act in strange and different kinds of ways. Sometimes they comfort, sometimes, in one case that I know of, our neighbor had cancer in broken arrow, and it was terminal, and her pet dog would not even go in the room where she was. And that's the way that little animal handled its grief about what was going on. Doing grief, and I'm going to be using that expression a lot, because we do grief. It is a work. It is a hard work. It is one of the most difficult works that it's possible sometimes to do in our entire life. Sometimes grieving for someone else is even more difficult than grieving about our own coming death, if we have that it is coming. Grief takes time, and there's a lot of people who want to rush their way through it, and they want to get it over and done with. Like I said in one of the expressions I used at the beginning of our session tonight, I want it over with. I want it done. I want it to quit hurting. But you have to work your way through it. You can't work your way around it. Just a moment. It's not that book, maybe it's this one. Oh yes. Maggie said to me about 2 years after the death of her husband, "I'll never get over it." We were in a grief support meeting, the author writes. As I turned to her, I heard myself saying, "Maggie, you are absolutely right. You could work and strain for the next 50 years, and you won't get over Roy's death. Neither can you get under it or around it, but Maggie, you can always go through it. You can always go through it." The way we come out on the top side of grief experience is by going through it, so that we don't have to fear the memories. We don't even have to be afraid when something occurs 2 years after a major loss that suddenly we have tears. We don't have to fear that, because we understand that's part of the healing process. And so we accept it and we work our way through it. We don't have to even dread it, except that it does take away from the joy of life on occasion. But we work our way through it, and it does take time. You can get through it. So many people who haven't learned this see their situation, for all practical purposes, as hopeless. And they feel helpless because of that perspective. They do not see that I will not always feel this way. They are actually convinced I will always feel the way that I do now. But what they also need to understand is that if it is a major loss, you will be a different person on the other side. If your mate dies, that part of you will never be there again. And you will learn to be a single person. And you will learn to fulfill some roles in life as a single person that you were not able to do, perhaps, when you were married. Same thing is true with other losses. We come out a new person. We come out a different person. And that new person can be stronger than the old person. You can't go back to the way things were. And that's one of the things that people who are doing counseling with folks in grief and in counsel recovery here. I just wished it was like it was before. And that isn't going to be the case. It can't be the case. So the willingness to accept yourself as a new person is part of the healing process. And that doesn't occur at first. It takes time for that to occur. There's some things that have to be done between here and here first. Going through the worst of the pain occurs first. But the reminder that you will be a new and in all likelihood a stronger person spiritually, you can understand that from the very beginning, even though you doubt it to be true. Let's look at the fact that grief is universal, and I've shared this already with some of our congregation. Job made the observation that man who is born of woman is short-lived and full of turmoil. And he's talking about the universal nature of grief coming to everyone. Matthew 5:44 and 45, Jesus even says this, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good." Now, in this context, the context of Jesus' sermon, those are blessings. All good things come from the Heavenly Father, in whom there is no shadow of turning, even to those who deny Him, even to those who hate Him, even of those who willingly and happily sin against Him. They still receive blessing after blessing after blessing. Now, the blessings they receive are not spiritual blessings if they're outside of Christ. For Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 3 says that all spiritual blessings are in Christ. But all of those physical blessings come upon the just and the unjust. But it's also true that He sends rain, hard times, losses, grief on the righteous and the unrighteous. And in the middle of all of that blessing and all of that pain is our free will. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to respond to God's blessing? How are we going to respond to the grief that comes our way because we are human? These things are very important. Here's what Jesus said when He saw a crowd of perhaps several thousand coming to listen to what He had to say. Seeing the people, He felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. And so grief is universal. It comes on everyone, but it does have a whole lot to do with how we handle it. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 4, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Not only does God comfort us, but we also are here to comfort one another. And there is a true sense, hear me, where we can comfort ourselves by understanding what's happening to us, by understanding that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and by understanding that God will be with us during the journey. We can even comfort ourselves. But I want to throw something at you. Christians, as a human, will have cancer, they will have heart problems. They will have tragedies happen in their family. They will have someone shot. They will have someone killed by a drunken driver. But there's also something else that comes to Christians, and that's because Christians are trying to do what is right in a world that values evil and its own moral values. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I would have to assume that when Stephen was being stoned, it hurt. I have to assume that when Saul, the Apostle Paul now, was being stoned, it hurt. That when he was beaten with a whip 39 or 40 times save one, it hurt. And it kept on hurting for a good while. And he would not have gone through that, and Stephen would not have gone through that, had he not been one of God's children. So Christians, you're going to get some things coming your way that people in the world will not get coming theirs. It just happens. Paul wrote a young preacher named Timothy, calls him an evangelist. Do the work of an evangelist. He said, indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And this verse, this is almost a staggering verse. When everybody in the world is trying to get along, Jesus says, do not think that I've come to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be members of his own household. How could that possibly be? Because daddy wants to do what's right, and son will not do what's right. Daughter-in-law wants to do what's right. Mother-in-law will not do what's right. And they become enemies of each other. Probably to the point that they won't even talk to each other. Possibly even to the point that they'll talk bad about each other. I know of a family now where bad talk goes around to certain family members about other family members. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. That's not the point. The point is, we're going to talk bad about them no matter what. And that's one of the things that happens when you're a Christian. Sometimes people will speak badly of you, and sometimes there will be divisions in your own family because you stand for the truth. Let me give you a few examples of grief. The grief of God. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And the flood followed shortly. God had Samuel to select Saul to be the next king, and Saul turned out bad. You see, when God selected Saul to be the king, he did not take away Saul's free will. He could still behave in evil ways. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. It says in Job chapter 30 and verse 25, have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? Consider the apostles when Jesus told them that he was going to be killed. He said this to Peter, James, and John coming from the Mount of Transfiguration. And he said, in talking about himself in the third person, they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day, and they were deeply grieved. Deeply grieved. Consider Jesus. There was a man who came on the Sabbath day who had a withered hand. And there were those who were watching, thinking, will he heal him? Because if he heals him, he will violate our tradition. Because our tradition says you can do anything you need to do to keep someone from getting worse, but you can't do anything to make them better because that's work, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath day. And Jesus healed the man, and it says in this passage, after looking around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Paul grieved for all the Jewish people who had rejected Christ. I'm telling the truth in Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience testifies with me in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing grief in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were cursed, separated from Christ for the sake of my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh. You see, the bottom line of grief is often the word loss. Loss. I collected a number of things from one of the books that I've been reading about loss, and right at the very top of the list is the death of a loved one. And interestingly enough, right below it is the death of a pet. I've known of people who have no children. Guess what they call their pets? They call their pets our children. I was actually studying with the lady one time, and she asked me if dogs went to heaven. And when I gave her the answer that we have no evidence that Jesus died to save animals, she quit the study. I don't want to hear that dogs can't go to heaven. Well, that's not exactly what I said, but that was the implication. That Jesus died for people, not pets. But people can grieve deeply for the loss of a pet, and if I'm not mistaken, that includes some of you. And I know it includes me. When I wept, when I took our little dog to have her put down, she was no longer able physically to function. A relationship loss. Maybe a dear friend. Maybe an acquaintance on work. Maybe a financial loss, losing a job, the market crashes. Maybe that's where all your retirement is. Anticipatory grief. This is the kind of grief we bring on ourselves, dreading something to happen, and it may or may not happen. Have you ever grieved over something that was going to happen and it didn't? I have. I know that's foolish, but I did it anyway. Anticipatory grief. We anticipate something bad coming along. And then there's ambiguous loss. This is where we're afraid of something that happened, but we don't know. Somebody's supposed to be at your house at 7 o'clock, it's raining hard, or there's ice on the road, they don't show up at 7 o'clock, what do you start thinking? Maybe they had a wreck. Maybe they were killed on the way. Maybe their car died and they're stranded. And we start imagining these things. It's kind of a free-floating kind of grief that can settle on almost anything. Almost anything. Loss of health. I'm thinking of one of our members in particular who is dealing with grief over loss of personal health. I think the person is doing well in handling that grief, but it's there. It is there. A miscarriage. Bless people's heart. When there is a miscarriage, many times the first thing they're told by somebody who's trying to comfort them is, well, you can have another one, you're still young. They do not realize that a miscarriage is the death of a child to the parents. And it needs to be honored and treated that way, with respect and dignity and concern. Retirement. grieving because I'm no longer needed, and I no longer have a job, and I no longer have a steady income from a job. Loss of a dream. Loss of a dream. When I first came here, I wanted to be chaplain for the police department, as I had been in the past in another place, at Broken Arrow. And I gave all of my credentials and all the continuing education and all the training I had gotten, and I gave them to the chief of police, and I don't know if he ever even looked at them. But I've never been called here to serve in the role of a chaplain. But I've given it to both the current chief of police, and I've given it to the current fire chief. But I've gotten to the point now that I'm done grieving that dream. It's something I assume that I'll never do again, and at this point in time, it doesn't even make me feel bad to say that. So sometimes we have dreams that we grieve. We may dream of accomplishing a particular goal and it doesn't happen. We may dream of doing something in our life that was so important. Sometimes we call those dreams our bucket list. But most bucket lists have holes in them. And some of our dreams just dribble right out the holes in the bottom of our bucket. And we grieve those dreams that we were not able to have. Loss of a friendship, loss of safety. And this is one of the interesting things about this book, No Time for Goodbyes. This book is written for people who have suffered tragic kinds of death. A homicide, a suicide, a death by a drunk driver, negligence on just a regular driver's part where it could have been prevented, and then of course those tragedies that are done on purpose. And this book talks about that. And what it also talks about is the fact that the people who survive often feel unsafe because this person may get out on bail who committed a crime. They may be put in jail for 5 years, and they don't know what's going to happen when they get out in 5 years. And there's that dread hanging over them because they have lost that sense of safety. I've even heard people who have had a burglary in their home say, I felt safe in my home until then, but I just don't really feel safe anymore. Loss tends to be the root of our grief. The depth of our grief can vary greatly. It depends to some degree, in fact it depends to a great degree upon our relationship with whatever's been lost. I mean, if this little doggy is my baby, then it's going to be a whole lot more to me than if this dog is a stray that came up and I hope somebody comes and gets him. There's a whole lot of difference in that. There's a whole lot of difference between the relationship that I have with my wife and even a godly woman that I know. There's a lot of difference. And so the relationship we have with what we lose. The story is told about a man who was driving along a terribly windy road in Colorado, and his car went off the road because he took the curve too fast and crashed. He lived and was able to climb up to the edge of the road and sit on the edge of the road. And the fellow drives up, sees him sitting on the edge of the road, and he goes up and he hears him saying, "Oh, my BMW, my BMW. I just bought that BMW and oh, I miss it so much." And the guy said, "Your BMW, man? Do you realize your left arm has been torn off?" And he says, "Oh, my Rolex, my Rolex, my Rolex." It's our relationship with people, our relationship with animals, our relationship with things that determine the depth of degree of our grief. Also, it has a very important bearing concerning the secondary losses we suffer when a loss occurs. We talked about this the other night in our Sunday evening class last week. If I were to lose Kay, who would wash my clothes? And you may say, well, that's something dumb to say. Not to me. She has taken care of my clothes ever since we married. And every time I look in my drawer and I see that and I think about her, I think about that gift that she's given me through the years. I can cook TV dinners, I can boil water, and I can go to friends' houses for lunch. But I'm not good at doing much more than that when it comes to cooking. So I'd have to start cooking. I'd have to start taking care of the house. I'd have to start doing all of the things that she did. Those are called secondary losses that a lot of people don't even think about when there is a loss. If a man loses his job, the secondary losses are major. And so it's not just the loss, I've lost my job. It's I've lost my dignity in being able to support my family. I have lost who I am because I consider myself to be a worker and a provider. And so much gets lost in those secondary things that we don't even stop and think about. In addition, one way that our depth of grief is determined is how did we learn to grieve when we were a child? What was the environment? Were we told, men don't cry, get over it, it's done, you ought to be through by now? I know that there are people, and possibly even in this auditorium, who've been told, you ought to be over by now. You ought to be over by now. And that's not helpful. That's not helpful at all. But sometimes children are taught wrong things when they are children on how to handle grief, because the parents may sugarcoat death to the point that when they say, Grandma's gone away, they're looking for her to come back. They're looking for her to come back because they don't know how to think in abstract thoughts. They think in concrete thoughts. And then, personally, what is your personal way of grieving acceptably? How is it okay when you're all by yourself to grieve? Or do you set limits on yourself and you say, no, I'll give myself 10 minutes to cry and after that I'm done. Or I'll give myself 10 minutes to think about this and then I'm done. How do you allow yourself to grieve will have an effect upon the depth of it. And then this last one is very important. In your grief, can you see yourself as being happy again and having some idea of what it would take? One of the things that is common for people who are going through serious grief, especially the loss of a loved one, is I will never be happy again, followed by the unspoken statement, because if I'm happy again, I will betray the person that has died. I will, in a sense, be unfaithful to them if I'm happy again. I know that to be true because I've heard people who've had losses talk about that very thing. Do I have the right to be happy again? And the expression that people use, some people are strong and silent, and incidentally, silent is not equal to being strong. Silent may mean it's been shoved in the back closet and one day that closet door is going to rip open and it's going to be merciless. So strong and silent, silence not always strong. Sometimes there's a whole lot of crying and apparent depression. You've seen people that break down. And someone else in the family you think is as close to this person as this one was, they're just kind of stoic about it. They handle it differently. One of the strains that married couples experience in the death of a child is the fact that wife and husband may grieve in such different ways that it works to separate them. It works to divide them because they're not able to share their grief because they grieve so differently. One person may need to talk about it often. The other person may need to talk about it only on occasion. And this person wants to talk, and this one really doesn't want to talk. Not right now. And so sometimes it can create divisions. A lot of times there's anger in the middle of grief. Did y'all know that anger is often a cover-up for hurt? It's often a cover-up for hurt. There was an event that happened in my life with one of my children, and I was very angry. And I went to a men's workshop, and they said, we want everybody here to write down one emotion that happened to you at an event that bothered you a great deal. Just write down what you felt. So I wrote down anger. And they said, good. Now write down 9 more emotions that could be connected to that same event. So I wrote down frustration. But when I got to the word hurt, I started crying. Because for the first time, I admitted that what really bothered me about that incident was the hurt that I felt. And that's why a lot of people in grief will be very, very angry because they're not willing to accept the hurt within themselves, because anger is easier to deal with internally than hurt. And so that's why sometimes people's primary expression seems to be anger. Sometimes it's helplessness. I just can't do anything. Now that's normal. It's normal for people to essentially be helpless in a very real sense for maybe up to a week or so, maybe even longer, maybe a month, where they can't make any decision. But sometimes that just keeps on and on and on. And it becomes the way they deal with it. If I'm helpless, I don't have to deal with it. But if I start doing something, then I have to deal with it. But my helplessness empowers me to avoid the pain. I want you to look at your handout on the page, on the side of the page that says childhood myths. Childhood myths are those things we incorporated into our lives as young children, and probably to this point, nothing has made us examine them and reevaluate them for their correctness in our adult world. Now is the time we need to reevaluate them and put them aside so we can do the healing process. Number 1, and it's not listed in importance, it's just number 1 on the list. It's not permanent. We often grow up being told we can never do something again. But this permanence usually lasts only 2 or 3 days. Example, remember back to a time when you were told to do your chores, or you would never be allowed to go to your friend's house again, or some other threat. Probably you were back playing with your friend within a few days and the chores still not get done. This is obviously merely a scare tactic, and yet your child's mind retained permanence as being equal to 2 or 3 days if nothing happened to force you to question it. Then that is still what is registered. Death may be the first permanent thing we encounter. There is no coming back. There is no like it used to be. Things will be different. And I will become a different person. And if I work my way through this grief with my hand in God's, accepting the pain, working through it, taking the time necessary to really heal, I can come out stronger in spite of the loss. Number 2, don't have feelings. Don't cry. Buck up. Be strong. I've learned in hospital visitation early on in my ministry that when a husband, a wife, or child is in the bed and they're in very serious condition, they're being strong for the family and the family's being strong for them, but they really do need to talk about what's really going on. There needs to come a time when you say, the doctors told me that this is terminal. We need to talk. We need to be honest with each other. I realize there's times when we need to be strong. We do not need to break down in front of a nurse or something like that, honey. But we don't have to be strong all the time. We need to be real with each other and deal with each other. And I confess that in my preparation for this series, I realized that I do all the bookkeeping. And Kay will be lost because I do it all on computer. And Kay's computer knowledge is limited. Mine, because I've enjoyed it and done it for years and years. So I pay my bills every Friday. I get on the internet and make sure everything balances. We're planning to take a class in adult education in accounting so that I can move the bookkeeping into the pencil and paper perspective to the point that if, I don't have any plans, okay? But if and when something happens to me first, she'll be able to keep the books. But we haven't talked about that before because neither one of us are planning to die. But we know it's going to, death is 100% unless the Lord comes. It's 100%. And so one of the childhood myths is don't talk about it. And then number 3, you'll be all right. Time heals everything. Folks, it doesn't. Time doesn't heal everything. Working through it in time will work toward the healing, but ignoring it and hoping it'll eventually go away isn't going to solve the hurt. It's not working through the hurt. Our life is kind of a bookshelf, and on this bookshelf are the events of life. Some of those books we like to pull down often. I like to pull the book down often about the first time I kissed Kay. Am I the only one that likes that kind of memory? I bet I am. But I like it. So I pull that book down every once in a while. But there are other books on my shelf that I don't like to pull down much. But I don't need to be afraid of any of those books on the shelf of my life because I haven't dealt with them. And sometimes people take the pain of a serious loss, put it in a book, close it, and every time they see it, fear it. God doesn't want you to fear the experiences of loss. He wants you to grow thereby, for He Himself said, all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. How can the death of a spouse be worked out for my good? I can grow by it. I can be drawn closer to God by it. I can learn how to comfort others by it. I can have the hope of seeing her again in spite of it. And I can be more than I was. But if I put that book on a shelf and I never look at it again and I put it up there as quick as I can, I will be afraid of it every time I look at it. And then number 4, The best way to grieve is by yourself. No. The best way to grieve is when you share it with others who are able to give you comfort. Especially those who have been through a situation similar to yours. Which in turn means that when you are well on your road to being healed, you will be healed additionally when you sit down with someone who's just started that journey and you comfort them. That in itself will bring comfort your direction. Let's take a look at the other side of that sheet. Life as it was, life back in balance. Nearly every book that I have read on grief has different words for the process of going through grief. They all agree that there's a process. Impact, second crisis, in other words, when you decide to suffer and bear the pain. Observation, when you choose to look at what's going on honestly rather than exaggerating it or ignoring it. The turn, when you decide to start, I'm going to get out of this and I'm going to be better. Reconstruction, it's when you're having to kind of rebuild your life without what you used to have and deal with those secondary losses. Working through it, it's when you engage with those things that are in conflict within yourself. And then integration, where you make the choices to live again. And I don't mean just exist again. I mean live again. Making that particular choice. It is not permanent. It is. Don't have feelings. Admit and participate and accept your feelings. Feelings are neither good nor bad within themselves. It's what we do with them. Take the time necessary to heal and do not try to grieve all by yourself. Impact, second crisis, observation, the turn, reconstruction, working through, integration. Here's Bob Dietz' steps. I kind of like his. It starts off with the fact that when a tragedy comes into our life, many times there is the why questions and what if questions. Why did it happen to me? Why did it happen to them? Why did it happen to such a good person? Well, what if I would have gotten, what if I had gotten him or her to the hospital sooner? What if I would have insisted they go to the doctor? What if I wouldn't have let my son borrow the car? What if? Those are killer questions. They kill your ability to work your way through grief because they don't have answers. Not satisfactory ones anyway. And so the what if questions tend to dominate that shock and numbness period. Shock coming first, followed, according to Bob, by numbness. Almost no feeling at all. I just don't feel anything. And then there's denial. I can't believe it really happened. It didn't happen. I know it didn't happen. We had a dear friend back in Fort Worth who had no children. Her husband worked on the railroad and he died. And for over 6 months, she would set the table for him. And when he didn't show up, she would say, "Oh, I forgot. He had to make an overnight run and he'll be here tomorrow afternoon." So she would feel good about that. She would leave the table set with his plate there, knowing that he was going to be back tomorrow afternoon. But of course he wasn't. But sometimes that denial continues to the point that reality never gets faced. But denial is a part of it. It can't be real. It just couldn't be real. It couldn't happen. This just can't be. And then sometimes we withdraw. I did that when I found out that I had kidney cancer. I found out on a Wednesday, and I told my wife, I don't even want to be here Sunday. Let's get out of town. We went to Branson. Went to this really nice motel. I thought that would be of some comfort till I heard the price. And I said to the lady, I said, oh, well, we just thought this would be a nice place. I just learned I have cancer, and I'm sorry, we can't afford this. We'll have to go. She said, just a minute. How much would you like to pay? $50? You got it. How long do you need it? Last time I was in Branson, I stopped at that motel, and I went in and I said, I need to talk to the manager. And I want to tell you how grateful I was for that gift of kindness that was given to me over 20 years ago. But when it came Sunday, I had worked through the withdrawal, and I was able to preach and enjoy doing it. But that's a small loss. That's one of those anticipated losses that I had not yet experienced. But the withdrawal was short. Continuing on, at that point in time, we need to start asking how questions and drop the why and what if questions. The how question means, how can I get through this stronger? How can I learn from what's going on in my life? How can I help someone else who may be going through the same thing? And that's when we start growing out of and through our pain. We acknowledge it, we accept it for what it is, and the consequences of secondary losses that come with it. And we start dealing with those secondary losses. In the books that I've read in preparation for this and my own personal experience, I've seen people, well, let's begin with my mother. My mother never kept books at home. So I worried, is Mama going to be able to even take care of the money when Dad's gone? She did fantastic. I couldn't believe how well she did. That was a secondary loss that she dealt with and acknowledged she needed it, and she came to the surface with the ability to handle it. And then there is the adapting and the renewal. I will live again. There's an elephant in the room. It is large and squatting. It is so hard to get around it. Yet we squeeze by with, how are you? I'm fine. And 1,000 other forms of trivial chatter. We talk about the weather. We talk about work. We talk about everything else except the elephant in the room. There is an elephant in the room. We all know it is there. We're thinking about the elephant as we talk. It's constantly on our minds. For you see, it's a very big elephant. But we do not talk about the elephant in the room. Oh, please, say her name. Please say Barbara again. Oh, please, let's talk about the elephant in the room. If we talk about her death, perhaps we can talk about her life, too. Can I say Barbara and not have you look away? For if I cannot, you're leaving me alone in a room with an elephant. Therefore we do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory, far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Grief work is hard work, but it is worth it. It will, if you allow it and work at it, you will be a person than you were before. Thank you for your time.